Hi, everyone. This is Alistair, and I have with me James and Emma from Public Digital. Public Digital is a consulting firm that works with organizations, both business and government, to disrupt and innovate and change their business. They did a lot of work on COVID tracking over the last year, certainly as all public servants have done. Emma, in particular, has been a senior civil servant in both the UK and New Zealand, and has done a ton of work in government innovation. And James, who's joining her today, was the deputy CTO of the UK government, and was involved in the formation of the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre. So to say that you were in the presence of a couple of people who've done a little work trying to get government to modernize and innovate is probably an understatement. Now, I'm going to go away. As you probably know, these Forward 50 extras are something we started doing this year for people who've bought tickets or have passes to Forward 50. It's a chance to learn before the event from a few experts around the world. And if you have questions, you're welcome to join in the chat. We like this format. It's interactive. It's reasonably intimate. And so you have a chance to spend a couple hours here with some people who've spent a lot of time working in government innovation. The only rule that we would suggest, as I see many of you have your cameras off, if you feel like putting your camera on, if your hair is as beautifully coiffed as mine is this morning, turn on your camera and say hello. It's nice to see that you're there. But if you don't do that, that's okay too. We don't mind if you're willing to sit back there and listen in. But it's always nice. Thank you, Eric, for putting your camera on. I think for the speakers, it's always great for them to see that there's actual human beings out there. Hey, Pascal. And there'll be some familiar faces that we've seen. Morning, Blair. The one thing we would say as we welcome people in here is keep your microphone muted, because we're going to record this for other people, and it will automatically switch to whoever has their mic active. So right now it's going to record me. And so if you don't have your mic on and your cat walks across your keyboard, you may inadvertently be the star of the show for a couple of moments. So make sure that you keep your cameras off. And Jordan and others, if you feel like turning things on, feel free to do so. We are going to use Slido for a little bit of interactivity, but without me rambling on too much more, as we welcome people in, James and Emma, why don't the two of you take a moment to introduce yourself to everyone?
Hello, thank you for joining us. And thank you very much for joining our session on de-risking on digital transformation. As Alistair said, we're going to attempt some interactivity so that, you're going to have to, how many digital people does it take to make a poll work and switch to the right screen for slides? But I'm looking forward to hearing from you. And do feel free as we go along to leave comments in the chat, questions, because it's always helpful to see what you're thinking, and hopefully we'll have time to come back to them as we go along. So interactivity in plenty of forms if you don't feel like speaking as we go. Is it worth, shall I share my screen, Alistair? Should we get started in that way?
Let's let James say who he is first, and then why don't you put your screen on, and the floor is yours, so you can do whatever the heck you want for the next 90 minutes or so.
So yeah, hi, thanks everyone for coming. I'm James. As Alistair said, I was the Deputy CTO for the UK government, helped set up the UK government digital service and National Cybersecurity Centre. And these days, along with Emma, a partner at Public Digital, where I kind of bring my technology background to bear, but on helping organisations create environments where they can do good things with technology. So less of the hands-on building things and more of the making it possible for other people to do that. And I was at the very first Forward 50 in person. So while it's a shame not to be with you in person today, it's really great to reconnect with this community.
So I'll actually say who I am this time, but I'm Emma. I'm also a partner of Public Digital. We're a small global consultancy, as Alistair said, that specialises in digital transformation. I personally specialise in digital strategy and helping leaders set the right conditions for delivery teams to succeed. I'm hoping for any opportunity to go back to New Zealand. If a small project should pop up over there, I hear they're having a nicer time in COVID. But like mostly based out of the UK. So, you know, Public Digital is a company. You can see the rest of or some of the team on this slide. We haven't been together like that for quite some time. We have a team of people with different skills from architecture, design, content. Most of us who've worked at the sharp end of digital transformation, and lots of us were in the early team at the Government Digital Service. So we'll be telling some stories from the UK and then some from our subsequent international experience. But if you spot us mentioning GDS by accident, that is the UK's Government Digital Service. As we all know in public service, kind of acronyms get embedded in your brain, and it's hard to get them out again. I will just sorry, and I'm trying to switch slides on two different places just to make my life difficult. We don't have lots of time for introductions, but it is always good to know who's in the room. So please do drop your name, organisation into the chat if you wouldn't mind. Just say hello. While you're doing that, this is how the workshop's going to run today. So in the first part, we're going to talk about the definition of digital, start from the basics, and what that means for how we approach change. And then we're going to focus on some questions we've seen senior execs in multiple sectors use to assure themselves about the pace, progress, and the health of their digital transformation programs. We will be asking for a little bit of audience participation, and for any discussion sessions, please use the raise hand function if you could, to indicate you want to speak. And to get things going, we're going to go straight to the bit of a warm-up session. So it's this question here now. A Magic Assistant is going to pop a link in chat. Hold on a moment. So if you wouldn't mind just clicking that link and going to Slido, and that will allow us to get your idea of what is your definition of digital. And it's just to get a sense, you know, temperature check in the room of what you think of that when we say that. Should open in a browser window. All right. So I'm going to show a few things magically coming up as we go along. So we've got working via an electronic platform, anything that leverages tech, yeah. Solutions using IT, internet era methods. Somebody's been reading the public digital literature, so thank you. It's a favourite phrase. Yeah, human-centered design, lean and agile. Good. I like using technology for a good cause as well. I like putting a purpose behind it. That's quite nice. So, you know, in general, you get a bit of a spread of definitions. Technology obviously comes up a lot, but there's a range of interpretation and understanding, and lots of you have recognised that it's bigger than just technology. It's more than tech, although tech is an important part of it. So I'm going to switch back this way. Thank you. I've successfully run a poll, so that's made me pretty happy. And I'm going to hand over to James, who's going to talk a bit about how we define digital.
So as you're probably all very familiar with, there's no kind of one definitive or generally accepted definition of digital. And Emma, the remote's not working, so I can't skip slides. And pretty much anybody who writes a digital strategy ends up having to start by defining what they mean in their context by digital. And those definitions vary massively, from those that are very much about futuristic technologies through very much how we change ways of working in our organizations, and how we think about the modern world, not so necessarily the future one. But to help us kind of unpack the definition that we use and introduce it, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Government Digital Service in the UK, which Emma mentioned. So many of you will probably have heard this story before, but the Government Digital Service was formed in the UK in 2011. I was the technology lead in the kind of the alpha team that laid the groundwork for Government Digital Service, produced the first product that we were responsible for, showing how government could present itself and interact online. And then I went on to take a role that was building out the technology team and capability effectively the sort of chief technology officer for the organization that we built. And GDS did a couple of things. It massively transformed public services digitally. Gov.uk, which you see on the screen, is the best known example of this. It was the starting point for making government services simpler, clearer, and faster. In the process, we broke the dependency on big IT, sort of big systems that take years to implement, usually by a very small number of suppliers. And by breaking that, we were able to give government a lot more levers to improve user experience, and we saved quite a lot of money along the way. And doing that precipitated a thing called the Digital Service Standard, which describes how to create great digital services, how to get a sense whether they're really great, and was sort of an early pebble thrown into the sort of stream of government that created ripples right across the UK, but across the world. So we've seen the influence of this work playing out in pretty much every continent in ways that are really exciting. But one question that we kind of dodged for the first few years of setting up government digital service, but couldn't dodge forever, was what did the digital in government digital service really mean? Many of your answers touched on this. We wanted to be really clear throughout that it wasn't the same as technology or IT. It's not just a more modern term for the same way we've been doing IT since, when did governments start doing technology? 70s, 60s. It wasn't a new brand on the old way of doing things. It was much broader. And technology is definitely part of the picture. And GDS had a major impact on the use and cost of technology in the UK government, but it's only one part, and often not the most important part. In fact, if you want to get the technology bit right, you need to shift the emphasis. And that's a big part of what we did and how we think about digital. So this is the definition that we tend to use, the one we've applied as we've prepared for today. Broad set of themes. It's about the internet era. It's about the time we're living in. It's about culture, processes, operating models, kind of how our organizations fit together and get things done, and technologies. But most importantly, it's about people's raised expectations. And that's the bit that I wanted to just talk about a little bit more. That final clause of the definition is critical because it helps to explain why digital change is so important and focuses in on the thing that can really determine whether we're successful or not. And that's, are we focusing on people's raised expectations? So to give one example of that, in the UK, as across the world, there's been a lot of emphasis on health data, how you understand your vaccine status and other things over the past couple of years. And there's been a lot of attention on the apps and services provided by the National Health Service. Some of it really positive. As we were sort of surveying what's happened, saw this whole series of tweets that looked at the fact that where previously you might have found that your health data was locked up in lots of different silos in your general practitioner's office, in your local hospital, in other places, teams behind the scenes have done a huge amount of work to help it flow smoothly between applications. So if you have the NHS application on your phone, you can see far more of your health record than you used to. You can see your vaccine status. You can easily book appointments for checkups and to get vaccinated. And there's some great tools for parents, something that Emma and I have both been very glad of, to understand how that affects your kids as well. That's really understood people's context and what's important to them. The main reflection that I've had as I've been looking at these tweets and other coverage of this is that many of these emotions are ones that are based on something you'd just assume with a lot of the private sector services that we've become used to in the last decade. Of course, you can go and see your order history with an e-commerce app. Of course, you can see bits of data flowing between the services you use. What digital government is responding to is people bringing those expectations to bear on how they see government working. It's still unusual enough for that to work well, that people get excited like this when they see it happening. But over time, that becomes less usual and raises the expectations that we all need to respond to.
And meanwhile, that counts for, you know, the public, but of course we know it's not just the expectations of service users. Public servants are users too. So particularly at the moment, people are becoming more and more used to working where they can get the work done. We can't roll time back in that aspect. So there's a real sense of recruitment and retention for the generations of staff who are used to being able to work using tools that just work and work where they need to. So if you want to attract, you know, the best people into the public service to solve really important missions, public servants can't be ignored. This is just an example. It's sort of on a hardware side, but an example of kit and equipment and the environment that we sometimes ask public servants to work in, and particularly in the operational side. The picture on the right is a viral tweet that we spotted where someone was using 2 mice because only 1 button works on each one. And, you know, you see that and you think, yep, I can imagine that happening in places where I've worked. One of my first projects in the public service was delivering a court listing system in our High Court. And I was just amazed at the workarounds operational staff would use to get around a bad setup and the patience with which they would do so. But we shouldn't be asking them to. This sorts of things can drain productivity in really largely unseen ways. So while we hope the pressure of COVID will ease, the expectations of staff, of service users, they're not going to go back, and we shouldn't want it to. There won't be a new normal or business as usual. We need to keep raising the bar, and that's why this is just so important. So to come back to this definition, what this definition of digital makes it clear is that responding to the consequences of that change are a job for the whole organisation. And this is just this is a quote from the UK's National Audit Office, and I'll read the whole thing. It says, when large digital business change programmes run into difficulty, the technology solution is often cast as the primary reason for failure. But there is rarely a single isolated reason which causes critical programmes to fail. Many of these programmes face intrinsic business challenges as well as technical challenges. I think I'd go further than this, and so would James, which is to say, yes, the tech might have failed, but there are 1,000 decisions the organisation has made that allowed that to happen. So many of the most, big IT project failures that you might have read about or seen or experienced, naming no names, they might have been given to the IT department or big supplier to worry about. And these fail, not because those people and that team were inadequate, not because they weren't intelligent or they didn't try hard enough, but because the rest of the organisation washed their hands of it. They said, we don't need to change, the technology will fix this. So keeping digital programmes separate from the wider delivery of services and your operating model, that will get you into trouble. Digital has to be a collective responsibility for leadership. Another kind of extremely well-known example of this is Obamacare. So Obamacare was the administration's flagship domestic policy, incredibly important. And healthcare.gov, the website that was supposed to be the front door for applications, it was outsourced, it was tech-led, it was waterfall, and it was a mess. And it fell over spectacularly. It led to an apology from the president, it harmed the policy's credibility, and it cost the US over $2 billion. So again, clearly the technology failed, but it wasn't a failure of technology. It was a failure of the organisation, of working practices, of culture, and of leadership. How did it get to the point where it was launched and it fell over and no one knew that was going to happen? So whether we like it or not, design and code is intrinsically linked to the delivery of our government services now. So separate them at your risk. So one of the reasons why returning to the operating model is important is because digital organisations need to be able to adapt and respond to new opportunities and threats. It's a lot easier if your organisation grew up on the internet. And in the public service, we don't have that luxury, but it doesn't mean that we can't still respond. Conditions that we might look for in digital transformation, so flexibility, pace, agility, they've unfortunately often been designed out of our institutions, but it doesn't mean they're not capable of it. And it doesn't mean that change is impossible. If you are watching and you have the levers and the opportunity to shift your operating model, take it with both hands. If not, we'll come on to the smaller ways which you can de-risk your programs. And it also means, it does also mean a different approach to technology. So it needs to be fast, it needs to be iteratively, and it needs to be relentlessly user-centered. I'm going to hand back to James to talk a little bit about what that could look like in practice.
One of the governments that we've been pleased to work with over the last few years is the state of California, who formed a team to look at a new way to provide access to the state's information and services online. They worked very much following a human-centered design approach with a small team, and they're an example of where the technology part of what they were doing went very well. They moved from a fairly static and slow approach to building things, to testing products with users, to a team that was able to iterate many times a day based on understanding what their users needed and produce a much higher quality user experience and access to state information at a sort of prototype level. They'd not scaled this up, but they built a team who could do that. And they kind of hit their stride just as the pandemic started. That team was able to very rapidly shift focus from how are we going to take what we've learned and transform the delivery of a broad range of state services online to how we're going to respond in the moment to the crisis we find ourselves in, and produced what I think is probably the best example in the world of a government providing clear, actionable information to its citizens about services available to them, what's going on in their state, and how they can get the support that they need. In 4 days, they stood up this new site, started iterating it, gathering user feedback, responding to the fast-moving situation. And you can see over time, it's changed to look very different as the reality in California has changed. But they got the technology bit right. They did it well, it scaled, it was good. The challenges that the team faced were the fact that they were hit with huge demand to put information out, to respond in the moment to asks from all over their government. And that those asks weren't necessarily coming from people who had the same mentality that they did, who had the same sense of how to make things work for users. And that's where we worked together on the thing that I think is the real transformative part of what they did. So this is the California Crisis Standard. Having seen that pressure that the team was under, we worked with them to write a first draft of a statement that laid out what should their users, their citizens expect of the information the state was giving them through this site. It brought together a lot of their thinking for the last few months, but really was a first move to say to the rest of the state government, this is how we are now going to operate, and to start intervening in the behind the scenes operating model by which they decided which needs to meet, how to meet them, how to make things clear and accessible. It took a lot of pressure off the team because the things coming into them were better formed. They were easier for them to deal with and get onto the site in a clear, simple way that met their standards. But it also started to really shift how people in the governor's office and other departments thought about communicating. So while the site was great, the standard was the transformative piece of what they were doing and the beginnings of a shift in their operating model. So having just talked about a COVID response, we are interested to hear from you before we dive into our questions for leaders, see if any of you have any reflections on lessons that you've learned through the pandemic about how change happens. So if anybody has anything they want to talk about, if you raise your hand and we will call on you.
Yeah, so just, I guess, very briefly, one lesson we learned, it's sort of one of those lessons we knew, but we're able to live out in real time, was the idea of what happens with the quick and dirty responses to COVID. We're doing a lot of work with the courts, and they had to very quickly respond to not being able to have in-person counters, but you can't just shut down your courts for a few weeks or a few months. So they, what I would call, put in place a Band-Aid solution, which was just sort of using email instead of physical paper. And it seemed to make sense at the time, but there wasn't any sort of, thoughtful design process to do that. And admittedly, there wasn't time for that. So a year later, it's created even almost a double backlog to what there would have been under the paper process. So what was created, while it was probably digital by some definitions, was far worse than even what they had before, where you could just stick a piece of paper over the counter and get a stamp and walk away. So we've been doing a lot of work to kind of remediate those Band-Aid fixes. But it just serves as a good lesson. It's not a blame exercise. It was an emergency, but we've seen times when there's no emergency, but a quick fix was sort of prescribed. And well, as they say, once the quick was done, the dirty remained.
Yeah, I think that's a common experience in many places of these new backlogs, and also realizing kind of what's easy and safe to change and what has unintended consequences. Dwayne.
Yes, hello. Just a real quick example. We in the Ontario government released a self-assessment app, really quick and dirty, and in the beginning of COVID, because people didn't know really much of anything at that point, and it was used highly. Uptake was great, and the real lesson that I kind of took away is the long-term usage and monitoring the usage of it, because in the beginning it was about am I sick or not, and doing that real self-assessment, where later on we started to realize a trend where there's a lot of positive results, or not positive, but just people going in and not getting flagged that they're sick, but just to say that they're not, so that they could enter different restaurants and different areas. And it was like a proof a proof that you're not sick at this time, and kind of a voucher that could get you in different areas. So that product really changed from that self-assessment into the proof that you're not sick, so you can get into different areas, and that type of authentication. So it really changed the whole product in its life cycle, and only noticed through data and monitoring.
And did you then make changes to that product and service?
I do believe that's what they are doing now. They're making these kind of changing it so it's not self-assessment, but kind of like a validation. So yeah, there is change to that, because they notice that's the usage more now.
So thank you for those. If we jump to the next thing, so those are two really useful and interesting reflections. As we've talked to a lot of the teams we work with, some of the themes that often come up around where change has been successful has started with the fact that over the last 18 months, everybody's had a pretty clear mission. Where before most governments were dealing with a huge number of priorities, for many of them, those haven't gone away, but one has risen to the top. That you've had, where things have worked, a much clearer direction from leadership, empowered teams, and particularly to connect with that last one, there's shortened feedback loops. People are much more inclined to look at very quick responses to what's working and what isn't, and iterate rapidly. Obviously, as we sort of heard a bit from Blair, sometimes the rapid decision making has led to unintended consequences there as well. And we've been spending time with some teams talking about how to make that more visible and to use what's happened over the last couple of years as part of the case for why more investment is needed to make safe change easier. But thank you for those. I think back over to Emma.
And so as an introduction to our second part, where we're thinking about questions for leaders, there's a set of principles that we might teach about how to design your digital transformation from the start. If you had a greenfield, like start small. But if you're like most governments, most people that we work with, that's not the environment you're working in. Often government projects are years in the making. And it's up to us to steer a course through what we have successfully, and do so in a way that gives the best outcomes for citizens. So that's why our focus today is about de-risking and better understanding what you've got and working within those constraints. We often, unfortunately, are asked to come in and help leaders understand why programs are failing. And we hope by taking some of these steps that a course correction can take place sooner. And although we framed it as questions for leaders, that doesn't necessarily mean in the senior sense. Actually, anyone can do these things. Sorry, I've gone backwards. So you're here, so you already know that digital and technology are important. That's got you in the room in the first place. But it's also true that leaders and decision makers, they make implicit and explicit decisions on digital and technology every day, all the time. It is impossible to run a government service without doing that. And we see the negative consequences. The news is littered with examples of digital services which are impacting people's lives. And we've really seen that in COVID. Governments' online services getting overwhelmed, examples where perhaps we're not able to reach vulnerable populations. We've seen the real life impact of not getting these things right, and in real time, in fast time over the last year. So it's not really possible for decision makers to say digital isn't really my thing. That technology stuff, that's not for me. That can't be the case anymore. Not everyone has time to become experts above your day jobs, but there are lots of non-technical steps anyone can take. And that's what we will be talking about. So to help you manage your digital projects, your program or transformation, here are some questions that we think you should be asking that will help you to understand the health of your program better. So the first is, how close are you to your users' experiences? I shouldn't surprise you too much. Are you focused on outcomes over solutions? Are you seeing value delivered in weeks, not years? Who designs your services and how? How are you testing your fears and assumptions? More positively, what are you doing to make change easier? And lastly, is it clear what your focus is? And we're going to step through these one by one. So this, as I said, it shouldn't be a surprise. It's both very simple and very hard to do. How close are you to your users' experience? Can you see what your users see? When you're working on a government program, it's really common for policy or project staff to end up being used as a proxy for real service users. That can be really well-meaning. There can be people who are experts who've been living this for years. But what it also can mean is that it leads to some assumptions going unchallenged that hurt you later when you put a service live. If you treat your own organisation as your users, there's going to be gaps in your knowledge. So the single biggest difference, if you took nothing else away from today, the digital organisations achieve is becoming genuinely user-centred. And some might use the term human or customer-centred. The intent of those things is the same. Either way, the point is that you make decisions based on what users need, not the organisation needs, and you test that regularly. You know, we've all seen the technology program waterfall plans, which have, you know, requirements 1 year, build 6 months, and then UAT testing 2 weeks before you go live. That's going to lead to a lot of surprises and not necessarily good ones. So if you want to de-risk your digital transformation, no matter your role, you should see prototypes, make visits, get as close to the real experience of users as you can. Reading papers or even looking at screenshots can only get you so close. At the Government Digital Service in the UK, we would often say that user research is a team sport. You might have a user researcher or ethnographer leading the work, but you should still actively participate. Everyone should actively participate. We used to have a goal of doing it, I think, for a couple of hours every month, and that's hard. But doing it sometimes is much better than never doing it at all. And to give you an example of this, we're going to travel back to California. In this picture, that's a team from the California's. Oh, that is my mouse again. Sorry, it's a very sensitive wheel. To give an example of this is the team from California's Office of Digital Innovation, and the user researcher is the lady in the check shirt there. And on the right are local officials and business owners who they're talking to about the challenges of rebuilding after a wildfire. So they've gone out for a field visit to actually talk to people. And what's even better in that picture is that on the left are some of the developers who are going to be building the services and information in response. James and I, we helped set up this team. We interviewed, I think, every single one of those people on the left before they joined the team. And we really saw for ourselves the change in attitude and perspective that the developers gained from better understanding the people whose need their work serves. They were good, good, keen developers, but actually this really opened their eyes and changed how they do things. So it helps for everybody to be reminded that you're not serving Jira, you're not serving tickets, you're serving people. So any way that you can build that in will help whatever you're doing to get to a better outcome.
As Emma just talked about, you're not serving all of those things, but it's really important then to be clear what you are. I'm sure you've all seen the sort of digital strategies that end up as a shopping list or a tick box, or to pick up on Blair's comment here, the sort of list of requirements that takes up all of your time and energy to understand and unpack, but doesn't actually help you understand what you're trying to achieve and for who. It's really important to shift that mindset from being inward looking, what do we need to build and buy, towards first, what change do we want to see in the world? What's the point of what we're doing? And not only is that important for leaders so that they can check, are we on track? Are we going the right way on this? But it's really important to bring teams together so that everybody is shooting for the same mission. The clearer that mission is, the easier it is to bring people with you within the teams that you've got. As we're talking about changing operating models, all of the other parts of your organization that are going to need to respond to what you're doing. So when Kennedy, the most cited example of somebody leading with an outcome, said we choose to go to the moon because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, he was setting an outcome. He was also saying what he wanted to achieve by it, but everybody was able to focus on that one thing. Easy to understand, easy to be motivated by, and pulling teams together. So what's a good outcome look like? It describes the change you wish to see, a thing that we've achieved, a shift in what's available to people or possible to people. It can be quite mechanical. It can be, we are able to process these things faster, in which case you need to say in service of what, but it helps you understand where you're going, not just what you're planning to do. It's expressed in a way that everybody involved will recognize, be able to rally towards, and it's at the right point in the future, not huge long-term aspiration. This is what the world will be like in 50 years' time. Probably not even what it's going to be like in 5, but a few years out is usually good. So that gives you some runway and some space to understand the changes that you might make and the best way to get there. And one way that we've often seen this expressed and which can help is to think about hierarchies of outcomes, because often as people get together to talk about the outcomes they want to achieve, they'll be starting from very different places. Some people will automatically gravitate towards the big, bold, visionary outcomes. Others will be thinking about the next thing they want to fix. And actually embracing that and working with it, say, okay, well, let's either start at the bottom or start at the top and kind of work out the layers and the hierarchies of these things, can be a really helpful way to bring teams together and to set the boundaries of what you're trying to achieve, while at the same time pointing everybody in the same direction.
So the next question to ask is, are you seeing value delivered in weeks, not years? You'll sense a theme here, but if you've spent a year gathering requirements and not seen anything tested with real people, then that's a bit of a problem. If you're a developer brought into a government environment, it's quite common when those types of people are new in, they sort of say, well, I could build that thing in the time that it's taken us to arrange 5 meetings to agree whether we should build it. And that's not bravado, it's true. Put together the right skills in a team, give them space, give them a mission, give them a mandate, and delivery can happen far quicker than the speed of governance. COVID-19 has illustrated that. Now, there are some not always positive consequences, as Blair mentioned. You actually want to make sure you've done it the right way. So there's enabling conditions to make that speed happen in the right way. But at the same time, you should be expecting to test things with real people much quicker than we quite commonly do in government. We kind of like the 18F. This is the 18F description of this, which is, the governance and the way you look at it should be biased towards demos over memos. Are you seeing actual services? Are you looking at what's being designed and built and seen it for yourself? And there's kind of 2 examples here which I want to talk about to demonstrate that. So the first is a risk register. I took a trip down memory lane this week and I looked at an old risk register from a project I worked on. And there was a risk in the top, it's marked red, which politely says, customer expectation about performance and functionality may not be met by the suggested scope of this project. It's very true to say that the functionality and scope did not meet the expectations of the users of the project. I joined it, I think 3 years in, and went in eager and took it out to see some users, and they were extremely unhappy about the functionality and scope that was offered. But I was able to see that, in a very sharp relief, because I looked over their shoulders as they tested it, and their dismay was kind of quite plain to me. But there had been, several years of risk registers and project reports that kind of hadn't got to that point. And I went back and said, hang on, I think something's wrong here. And changes to the project happened because of that. So that was my kind of frontline experience of doing it. So that's just myself as a team member. The other example I want to give is, this is an example from Universal Credit, which is one of the UK's flagship benefits programme. It's been a huge change programme for job centres and for the way we deliver benefits in the UK. And just to the right of that small pig there, in the middle of the picture, is the Secretary of State in Duncan Smith. And he has come to the demo to watch the team and for them to show him what progress they've made. And that's brilliant on several levels, because he has been persuaded to come and have a look. And that also means he can ask better questions. He's not saying, well, what am I being told by this document? He's seeing what the team's doing. So any way you can facilitate that, either way, by getting leaders in, going to them, making sure that you're demoing real things, that is a fantastic way to de-risk, because it means everyone actually knows what's happening. Because another thing that we quite often see is that the team on the ground delivering, they might know something's wrong. And actually what happens is it goes up the chain of leadership, various papers, things get softened, things get eased. And actually the person at the top doesn't hear the real message. So trying to find ways to break that down and bring more transparency, that in the long term is a much more healthy way to approach things. The next question is who designs your services and how? So that, it says number one thing, but I think that's the user research. But how you can de-risk your digital projects is know that you've got the right set of skills available. They're all important. As well as being able to deliver for you, they're going to help you become a more intelligent customer when you're buying services and projects and products as well. Your team is one of the most important things. So you need leaders, but you also need doers. You need experts. It may sound obvious when you say it out loud, but the secret to great digital work isn't magic. It is good teams. All the strategies, collective leadership, slides, looking at different technologies and analyzing which one is best, they won't save you if you don't have a good team in place. And our definition of digital from earlier has implications for the skills you need and all the conditions you as an organisation need to provide to let them thrive. But a team is at the heart of it. And we think you're in a really good shape if your organisation has these broad three things. So you need to have internet era skills. So that's people who understand user-centeredness, people who understand and advocate for cloud-based technology, perhaps modern approaches to security, and have the mindset to work iteratively. We often find that sometimes those skills need to come from the outside initially. Public servants are absolutely able to adopt and thrive in those ways of working, but it's hard to see the change if you're in the middle of an organisation that's not working that way. So you need those skills inside. You need to have multidisciplinary teams. So by that, we don't just mean in the digital sense. We don't mean have a developer and a designer. What we mean is that you're bringing in to the project the whole range of people that are going to help it be successful. The antithesis would be that model of business on one side, IT on the other. You definitely don't want that. What you need is to bring together design, technology. It might be lawyers, it might be operational staff. It could be a stakeholder group from the outside, actually, who might be part of your own team. But all the people who might be impacted, bring those in whatever ways you can. And that team will probably change over time. But getting people in there, I was about to say in the same room, in the same virtual room, getting in the same working space is what you need to succeed. And the last aspect is that teams need to be responsive. So as James said earlier, what we've seen the most successful teams do in terms of COVID in the last year is develop really quick feedback loops so they can iterate and respond quickly to feedback. This is sometimes referred to as agile, but that often starts a bit of a project management culture war. So let's just say responsive, because it's important whatever you're trying to do. You want to be responsive and you want to build in quick feedback loops. So internet era skills as part of your team, multidisciplinary, so not just internet era, and being responsive and user focused. And I should say, you also don't have to have the perfect team. Find ways to start bringing this in if it's not what you've got now. It's better to start than aim for perfect. And it's also worth saying that this kind of multidisciplinary approach, it also has implications for the way that you work with suppliers. Ideally, it should be one team. You shouldn't really know who's a supplier, who's a contractor, who's a member of staff. You shouldn't be able to see the joins. Now, there's a lot of cultural hard work that goes in to making that happen. But if you can find ways to be united behind a mission or an outcome or a way that you're improving public services, then that will get you quite a good distance. When it breaks down, you tend to get into that one throat to choke type approach to suppliers. That in itself is a bit of a red flag because it suggests that the relationship is broken down. So if you've got that kind of approach, start thinking about how you share the burden and how you are working together to get to the right outcome.
Thanks, Emma. So this screen grab is from my favorite error page on any project that I've ever worked with. If something went wrong with the prototype of the very early version of gov.uk, this is what a visitor would see. The lion as the symbol of England and the unicorn as the symbol of Scotland, blaming each other for the upset, but sort of acknowledging that these things happen. One of the things that let us get moving really fast with our transformation in the UK was taking a really different approach to risk to most government projects and programs, in that we were really quite risk tolerant. The biggest risks to us were not demonstrating that a different way of working was possible, not moving at pace, not producing something that people found compelling. They weren't the sort of classic risks of worrying too much about system failure or scaling of some of the services we were building in the early days. But it wasn't that we were blind to those risks. It's that we accepted them. We were a bit playful with them at times, hence commissioning this cartoon. And we said, you know, these aren't the biggest problems for us. We'll be prepared, but we're going to put our focus somewhere else. It's really, really common for projects and programs and services to have long risk registers and red, amber, green statuses about whether they're on track. It's really rare to find those well managed and well used. They're usually kind of checking whether we're delivering what we expected in the way we expected, not are we doing something that takes us towards our outcomes? Are we building resilient services? Are we making the right trade-offs? And that sits in this quite passive approach that many organizations have to risk management. We log them, we don't test them. We don't see if we were right, that this risk might manifest in this way and have this impact. Or when we do, we try and manage them with project management levers rather than that multidisciplinary team that Emma was talking about. But the success of the work we're doing relies on producing resilient services that meet the outcomes we've set, not on how pure our project management approach was or how comprehensive our risk register was. And it's only by really shifting that approach, by making sure that everybody's really clear about the assumptions they're bringing to what we're doing and the fears they've got about what could go wrong, that we can let teams respond and design solutions. Ask how and when might that happen? What would the real impact of that happening be? And how can we design for that situation? And Emma talked earlier about Ian Duncan Smith, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, showing up for that universal credit kind of show and tell session and seeing the work himself. One of the things that having him in the room meant was that he could tell the team what he was worried about, and he could hear what the team was worried about. He could say what, as the public face of this piece of work, the politician whose re-election relied on it, was willing to accept. What would he stand up and defend? How far did they need to go? And also listen and understand if perhaps there were policy shifts that could make a difference, or resourcing or communications could be different to help the team be more successful. Without making those fears on both sides explicit, they wouldn't have been able to move at nearly the pace that they did. So when you make those things explicit, you give teams the opportunity to design tests. We've seen that in software development as automated testing of both how this should work and what will happen if it goes wrong has become more the norm. And in the security world, as you know, for a long time, we've done a certain amount of penetration testing, but increasingly it's common for teams to actually assume that parts of their service have been compromised by an attacker and simulate the response to see how well they can respond and how well they can deal with it. But you can also apply that approach much more widely. So one service I was involved in the UK was the MOT process, which is every year, if you own a car, you have to take it in for some testing to make sure it's still roadworthy. They were moving from a 20-year-old system, which relied on a physical data center that was about to be demolished, and these great 1990s terminals, which were sent to every garage that did the testing and had nice modems with their squeaky sounds for connecting on them, to something web-based. That web-based system was much more scalable, much more flexible, and frankly was going to be a lot more reliable than what preceded. But what was really encouraging was when you started talking to the team about what might go wrong. They talked about the possibility of the technology failing, but they had people in the team who'd worked with those garages for years and knew about the paper fallback processes that could pick up the slack so that for drivers, there was no interruption of service. And they planned for the extra capacity that they might need. How would you bring some people on to process that paper if that happens? So they'd accepted that failure. They had a good sense of the likelihood of it, and they had a fallback plan. They'd really actively engaged with it, and they tested all of these processes. And that meant that when they came to talking about the risks, they could make people much more comfortable. They could shift the conversations away from what might go wrong to we've really thought about it, build confidence and have plans in place. And the result's been an extremely resilient service. That from some headlines where drivers' organizations were worried that the world would fall into chaos from it rolling out, there's been absolute silence because it's just completely worked. And then as we start to scale what we're doing, every change that we make can have more consequences. So early on, when you're setting up a team to make some change, it's fairly easy to bend processes, to work around them, to hire the first few people using some loophole in your hiring regulations. But as you scale up, the energy that it takes to work around that, the energy it takes to deal with the friction that all of that working counter to your existing processes takes, becomes unsustainable. They go from being annoying friction to major blockers. When we're talking about transformation, what we should be doing is not just working around, hacking our way through bureaucracy. It's changing it so that it fits the way that we want to work without sacrificing the principles underneath. So as you start to move from a kind of, have we got our outcomes right? Are we clear about what we're trying to achieve? And have we got a team in place? You need to start looking at where's that friction coming up? What are the things that are hard for this team that shouldn't be? And using the political capital that you're hopefully getting from people seeing progress over time to make the case for shifting systems. So not can we work around this to hire these new skills that we need, but can we make hiring those skills in this way the new normal? Not the heavy lifting to figure out how we get around procurement to buy some new cloud service, but making that normal. It's essential to invest in that. How do we make change easier if you want to be successful at scaling and doing more of these things and focusing on the real problems over time? So from a technology point of view, there's always a sort of looking at, are we really clear about which bits of what we're doing are essential for us to own and operate, and which things should we be buying? And are we thinking in a modular way that lets us produce a system where the things that we're likely to need to change regularly are easy to change, and the things that we're not likely to need to change much, where the market has a good standardized solution, that we're using those in that way. The clearest place that that's played out for most organizations in the last decade has been, are we shifting to using cloud because a lot of our infrastructure needs aren't likely to change so much, and building teams that can, in an agile way, experiment with the differentiating parts of our services rapidly. But it's not just about technology. One of our colleagues, Dave Rogers, was asked about scaling agile a while ago, and his answer was one we liked so much we made a website out of it. So on our next slide, you've got so really scaling work of this sort, whether it's agile or just any sort of transformation and change, requires you to make systemic changes to things like how you manage, how you procure, how you create your strategy and adapt it based on what you're learning, your skills, your language, your culture. It's not so much about adopting frameworks that lock you in, because they'll eventually make change harder again. But it's about really investing in those underlying systems so that you can keep making change and keep focusing on what's valuable.
Thanks, James. So for those listening on the end, this is a sort of 5-minute warning of future audience participation, because it'd be great to get your reflections on some of these. But the last question that I think it's really important to ask, and this is a tough one for a lot of reasons actually, but is it clear what your focus is? And more importantly, what it isn't. I've used a recent government digital service strategy as an example of this, because what I quite liked is that they published not only what their strategy is, but all the things they're not going to be doing. So two things happen in government, it's pretty common. So the first is that if you're doing really well and you're delivering things well, people see activity and think, brilliant, I want part of that, and come to you asking for things. So it's really important at that point to understand where you might be saying no and why, keeping your focus on your mission, keeping the focus on where you can make the most impact. So that's a sort of positive scenario actually, of where things are going great. Why wouldn't you say yes? Why would you not start delivering more things? Well, partly because you sort of weigh yourself down. That's a positive scenario. The other thing that's really common, and this is partly in the way that we tend to finance big projects in government, and we tend to think about things for a long time and then hang off a lot of ideas of what could be solved with a given project. Not being too particular, but if you're perhaps working on a program where you're delivering line of business operational changes, process improvements, changes to the way that people on the front line are working, as an example. And you might also find that you've got a program where you're solving how people pay government or how they authenticate into your service or log in. That's really common. You're building a Swiss Army knife, and with that comes increased risk, simply because actually those are quite distinct challenges. Each one could take up a whole team's time and energy. So the first thing to say is you're not alone. It happens all the time, lots of different places. But second, you're doing too much. So finding ways to de-scope or to prioritize or make sure that you're delivering the most value to users first are good ways to refocus back to where your mission really is. With that, I'm going to recap our questions. So, how close are you to your users' experiences? probably the most easily actionable of all of these, in terms of any individual being able to make an impact and a change here? Are you focused on outcomes over solutions? Are you seeing value delivered in weeks, not years? Who designs your services and how? How are you testing your fears and assumptions? What are you doing to make change easier? And is it clear where your focus is? And what we'd like to ask you is which of these questions would you or your organisation find it hard to answer? We'd love to hear places you might find it hard, questions, or any reflections on those questions that we've laid out.
The focus on making change easier has tripped me up lately a lot. I agree with everything you've described in the approach, but there's been the challenge to, well, people perceive a challenge to authority. Those in kind of middle and upper management find their role, or what they feel their role is, shrinking. I used to sign off on the requirements document, or just some of these ceremonies and powers that they used to have that gave them a feeling of more control. And now they're seeing we can actually design and develop and deliver some really good things just by spending a lot of time with either really senior people on outcomes or frontline delivery people. And that middle management part is suddenly feeling, well, wait a minute, well, what's my job then? Which is, of course, hugely important to run the operation and so on. But some of those design decisions, well, what we would call design decisions, don't really sit with them anymore. No matter how much time we spend, no matter how many co-design workshops, some are really threatened by that. And to be honest, I've not got a good answer to that yet.
Yeah, that sounds like a very common challenge, and there is no one answer to it. One thing that I've found can be very effective is the seeking out just the one or two people in a certain sort of role or function who perhaps are a bit frustrated with how things have been. So building bridges with the cybersecurity community in UK government, where early on we were told you just want to avoid them for as long as possible, and we knew that wouldn't work. But we found people who were often brought in to review major technology programs right at the end, saw all sorts of flaws in them, but had no levers to do anything about it. And there were a few of those people who had got burned and got frustrated by that, and responded incredibly well to the being brought into the co-design workshops, as you mentioned. We couldn't transform that community and that function overnight, but that small number of sort of frustrated people became the most effective ambassadors. They could bring their colleagues along in a way that we couldn't, and they got associated with our successes. So we spent quite a lot of time giving them a lot of credit, which really helped as well, because other people then wanted a bit of that.
Yep, that's great advice. Thank you.
I would add that there's something about repositioning those roles, because actually that great delivery team, they're going to come across a lot of blockers in government. We might hope that their overwhelming brilliance and service delivery is going to actually make them hugely successful, and that's the end of that story. Well, we all know that's not the case, actually. It gets you part of the way, but those middle managers, they need to be operating the machine. They need to be, servant leaders to that group, unblocking things, doing the paperwork, writing risk registers, actually paving the way for that team to continue. So I think it is a shift, because it's not a sign-off in the same way, but I do think there is huge control and power and importance in navigating the system. And if you could make those people see that that's their role, that would give them a different kind of power. Jordan, do you want to come in?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And thanks so much for your talk today. It was really great to hear in a bit more detail what some of the main questions are and what we can do about them. And I just wanted to come in with a comment about my other project that I'm working on in the Government of Canada, which is with the digital standards, which I saw reference to in that opening slide. It's fun to see it being referred to everywhere, and kind of horrifying because we're in the middle of redoing the guidance and rewriting things and going through plain language reviews and all that. I work very closely with the expert responsible for that. But right now we're developing a peer assessment framework to make sure that other departments know that they're actually aligning to this, and having behaviors that they know actually go along with the digital standards and being evaluated in a nice way, not in a punishing way. And we've created a cross-government working group on this, and we are making it up as we go. So we are trying to figure out how to answer a lot of these questions of like how to be close to users, how to make this work. We're creating a lot of friction, I think, right now within existing processes in the Government of Canada, trying to figure out where it might fit. We have a lot of support from the system, like the minister, management. The stuff is online, it's being shown and I don't want to use this government word, but socialized everywhere. But there still is a lot of friction, and it's a very, very long process. And we're doing reviews with our current policy people, and we're trying to like get these tiny compromises, and it's just very difficult to make things actually stick, actually change, instead of just talking about it. Yeah, I don't really know if you have any comments on that or any help or advice you could offer.
But I might say unhelpfully kind of keep going because two things. There is a point at which some friction is inevitable. I think you know that, which is just some friction is inevitable and you can't please everyone. So there's a point at which you just have to draw a line and hopefully have the confidence and leadership backing to say, okay, no, this is what it is. We've done a very long collaboration process, but actually this is the way we're going. James, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think part of it is, again, with the last answer, the sort of finding the small number of advocates for something. There's also like the first time a set of standards heads off something that people were really worried about can be really important and often a hard story to tell, but if you can find ways to kind of talk about that. And the talk about it reminds me, I think when we were doing the UK standard, some of the most powerful things were where people working elsewhere in government wrote blog posts about how they'd approached meeting the standard that we'd set and how it helped them be a better team. And we didn't really actively cultivate that. But if I was doing it again, that's what I do is go encourage some other people to talk about it for me.
That sounds great. Thank you. And I just also wanted to plug, if anyone wanted to help or have advice or guidance or comments or changes that they'd like, you can email myself and the analyst responsible directly. He really wants other people to just like feed in if they have good ideas, better ideas than ours. So I'll put his email in the chat, and they're usually open for public consultation, but we're just revising the document right now. So email is what we have, but thank you.
Thanks, Jordan. Looking forward to seeing what comes out the other side. Donna, did you want to ask a question? And then there's one in the chat as well.
Hi, thank you. I guess I'm coming from a public sector approach here within a provincial government within Canada, and it's very different. I think it's been interesting to hear everyone's conversation. And my background is information management and compliance, and there's so much rigor around that we have to do. And I think sometimes it goes at odds with digital. And sometimes I don't find that we're always the partners that we need to be in some of those approaches. And I think, when you work within compliance, there's things that I guess that we don't like in how we do things, but we sort of have to do it for a variety of reasons. And, I think it's one of the key lessons that I've seen as well is that, I am to the table up front can make things a little easier than coming in at the back. Sometimes we're always engaged at the end of this and saying, oh, well, this is how we're going to do it. And you guys are all on board, right? And then we're like, oh my God, how do we make this, process that's gone on in some antiquated ways within our records management and make that happen in a way that sort of meets the criteria for both sides of the table. So I think, some of the things we're trying to do that make that change, it can be hard. Like with any, whether you want to call it an IT project or not, or what anything you're doing, IAM owns that information. At the end of the day, we're trying to do our best to manage that and share that. And our core principle is to make it accessible and usable and affect better decision making. But I think sometimes we get dragged along a little later and they're more worried about, say, core information protection of the type of information necessary than how we can bring in. But I think we're great partners to bring everybody within your organization forward as well. Because when you make things easier from an information management perspective, it does make it easier for so many others. But it's definitely a partnership we've struggled with to try to get all of that together. And I think, one of the slides mentioned about, or one of the comments earlier mentioned that I was a clerk 30 years ago. I know how that works. And I think sometimes there's a assumption on IAM and that it's potentially just IAM. I know how that works in those things. And I think going forward, really taking the time to engage that group in your organization, we're going to see the impact pretty long after this project has changed and moved on to the next one. And it's one of those things to sort of keep in mind, I guess, as we're going. But, we see those little improvements as we try to push forward as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna. And totally agree. Trying to break down and get to know each other and find opportunities on both sides. You don't want IT to be the department of no, and compliance isn't the department of no. Actually, it's doing a really important function. So that's where having multidisciplinary teams, having representation, trying to make it a one team approach. And I know it's hard. The more you can do that, the more it can break that down. James, I'm interested to know if you've got a perspective on it as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. As will have been clear from some of my other answers, my main sort of overlapping experience has been particularly around security assurance and security sign-off. And other than the kind of a few like-minded people who would traditionally have been on opposite sides, kind of finding each other and working together. The other thing that we found super helpful was when the cybersecurity folks worked on a set of principles that helped. So I was coming from the change, Alistair's kind of show. I was coming from the I'm here to make change side, and they were perhaps coming from the let's resist that a bit side. But as they started to lay out more at a principle level what was important to them, what they worried about, we were able to find a common way of thinking about things and introduce various aspects of risk management, and I've seen doing the same thing with information management into a team's processes and ceremonies that can work, but it's all really about starting with some interpersonal relationships and finding some people on each side who want to take each other seriously, and that's always the challenge, but also the magic when you find it.
I just wanted to touch on Kay Bowman. Sorry, I don't know your first name, but saying here that I've been promoting and selling the message in our organisation that it's not an IT project, and that departments, users and managers of the areas affected want to sit back and wait for a delivered solution. Yeah, I mean that is a recipe for the delivered solution, not to fix their business issues. And I think we also see something quite commonly where you hope that technology is magically going to solve everything. There's a magic wand where you can build in the perfect system that's going to solve all of these things. And actually, as we know, quite often the business has to change a lot as well. The technology shouldn't be fitting around processes that have existed for 20 years. There needs to be change on both sides. So I don't have an easy answer to that, except I feel your pain. And yeah, we completely agree. That attitude is one that needs to be tackled. So there's just oh, you go, James. You're going to say something.
I think we were going to point at the same comment. So Rita's comment about bringing policy in. One of the things we could have talked at much more length about was that universal credit sort of benefits reform program, which was really the biggest thing happening in UK government in the last 10 years, in terms of bringing 6 or 7 different social security benefits together into one program. That had started out as a very separate IT delivery and policy process. So some big IT vendors were given a set of big policy documents and asked to implement them. And that failed quite dramatically. It was getting parliamentary scrutiny of like hundreds of millions of pounds wasted. That scrutiny was the thing that created the opportunity to go in and say, this needs to be done in a very different way. There was a bit of it that needed to come to a crisis point to bring things together. But once it had hit that stage, the people leading the new way of implementing that worked really hard to just bring policy people into the room with the digital service team and kind of tutor them in being like the product managers and product owners, but also the guides to help the team understand what was important and what wasn't early on, to work out what are the most challenging cases we're going to have to solve. And by just working together for a while, with a lot of push from the very top, saying this has to be done in a different way because the old way wasn't working, they were really able to model a much more iterative approach to both delivering the core of the new service, but also thinking about some of the deep policy challenges in it. And they did the same thing with the operational side of the service. So rather than saying, we're going to build a new system and then we're going to give it to the job centres, which were the front line in that case. So let's bring people who run some of those centres in as well to help us design this, so that you've got face-to-face operations and policy and technology and design all in the same room. That making that happen requires a very sort of senior commitment to get it started. Once a few of those people have seen how liberating it can be to work in that way, it can acquire a life of its own.
Yeah, and Alistair, we'd I think agree on your perspective as a private citizen, that there is quite often a gap, you know, between policymakers and how do you turn this law into a service. Absolutely. I feel like in the UK we have made some progress on that, but there's definitely a lot more to do, because actually those silos in government are quite strong. You know, they're quite hard to break down. I think with that we may hand over to Alistair to wrap up, but I just wanted to say thank you hugely for participating, for listening, for hearing our questions. We'd be more than happy if you had reflections, if you wanted to ping us an email or say hello, and hope to see you again another time.
Awesome, and thank you so much, both of you, for doing this. Hopefully you got your questions answered. It was nice to see some familiar faces. And I saw you posted in the chat, James and Emma, how people can reach you. Some great lessons in here, and I do think that you know, this kind of thinking about the tension between people who are paid to change and people who are paid to keep it the same. You know, I have friends who work in IT ops, and they've got a sign next to their cubicle that just says "What changed?" Because that's the first. If something broke, what changed, right? If that's the case, if you're that person, your job is to make sure it doesn't change, because everything was fine until you touched it. And there's other people whose job it is to touch it. And I think that tension, until we realize that the goal is actually to produce an outcome that requires those two functions, we're always going to be at loggerheads to some extent. So thank you so much for doing this. One quick note to those of you that are here, thank you for joining us. We do have now our next Forward 50 Extras. As you know, we've kind of stretched out the conference this year with a few of these online workshops like this, and we'll be recording them and putting them in the community platform. Donna, I see you have your hand up. I'm not sure if you do actually have your hand up or if you're just applauding, but it went away. So if you have a question, you can ask.
I could applaud too, if that was what you would like.
Sure. Did you have a question?
No, I'm good. Thank you. Just a misstep not unticking the box.
Oh, that's great. And so I just want to let you know, September 16th, we have another fantastic Forward 50 Extras. A friend of mine, Ayodele Odubela, who goes by the Twitter handle Data Sci Bay, which is pretty amazing. She is a phenomenal person. She's very, very smart, and she is really good at thinking about algorithmic bias. I've seen her give talks on this. Fantastically entertaining. One of the funniest presenters I've seen. So from 10 to 11:30 on September 16th, for those of you that have tickets to Forward 50, there'll be another workshop focused on algorithmic bias and how to think about data science that I promise will be entertaining and eye-opening. So James and Emma, thank you so much for being here. For the rest of you, I hope to see you again on the 16th for IUW session, and really appreciate you joining us this morning. Hopefully it gave you some stuff to take back to your desks and put to work. And for those of you who are public servants, thank you again for the tremendous amount of work you've put in, often thanklessly, over the last year and a half to keep this country running well. It has made me prouder than ever to be a Canadian. And I know that a lot of that work is due to many of you staying up late and not really being appreciated for what it's taken to hold this country together. So we all thank you very much. Have a great day.